wanted to put a plug in for Moss Adams because they have been such a great community partner. If we need anything, if we need a room for our BR&R meeting, business recruitment and retention meeting, they're there. If we need a speaker for a Southern Oregon Business Innovators Group breakfast, we call, they have somebody there. So we really appreciate all you do for us. So Jason Lukaszowicz will, and I worked on that, Jason, I get it right. We'll introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Kathy. And that was a great pronunciation of my name, so I'm impressed. Well, we very much appreciate this opportunity to be a sponsor and a supporter of SOREDI. They do a great job organizing this conference every year, and like I said, we appreciate the opportunity to be one of the presenting sponsors. I know many of you are already familiar with Moss Adams, but I just want to share a little bit of information about our firm. Moss Adams is a leader in assurance, tax, consulting, risk management, transaction, and private client services. Founded in 1913, we currently have a staff of over 2,500 that include 290 partners. From our offices across the West, we focus on serving public, private, and not-for-profit enterprises across the nation through specialized industry and service teams. Here in Southern Oregon, we have an office of 40 individuals with 5 partners. We also have a worldwide presence through Praxity, a global alliance of independent accounting firms that gives our clients seamless access to trusted expertise for more than 35,000 professionals in over 100 countries. Today, we are excited to have one of our own as a presenter at the conference, Rebecca Pomering, who is the Chief Practice Officer of Moss Adams. As the Chief Practice Officer, Rebecca oversees the firm's client service and growth strategies. She is responsible for implementation and growth of the firm's national industry practices, as well as the firm-wide marketing and business development functions. Rebecca joined the firm in 1997 and spent 11 years as a management consultant, providing consulting services to wealth management firms across the country on business strategy and management. In 2008, Rebecca was named CEO of Moss Adams Wealth Advisors, a division of Moss Adams, to lead the firm's integrated delivery of wealth management services. In this role, she was responsible for strategic planning, sales and marketing, team development, and mergers and acquisitions for the wealth management group, as well as the group's integration with the overall firm. Rebecca has co-authored 2 books on business management and is a frequent speaker on a broad range of leadership and management topics. She's a founding advisory board member of the Moss Adams Forum W initiative. She has also been recognized on Investment News Women to Watch, Wealth Managers 50 Top Women in Wealth, and Accounting Today's 100 Most Influential People in Accounting. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Pomering.
Tim, thanks so much for that very optimistic close and leaving it to me to raise everybody up so they have the hope to make it to the break. So I'll do my best to get your heads back up. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really tickled to be with you. Can you hear me okay? I adjusted the mic a little bit. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about managing a multi-generational workforce. This is a topic that I have studied for probably 15 or 16 years, and I'm going to cram 15 or 16 years of study on this topic into the next 25 minutes. And I'm a fast-talking Midwesterner to begin with, so I'm going to move at a fast pace. This isn't anything that I have professionally, I have not written books on this topic. A lot of this insight will come from things I have read, things I have observed in the workforce, things we've seen as we're working with clients who are integrating multiple generations within the workforce. So hopefully it'll give you some insights and some fun observations to think about as well. So a couple of really important disclaimers to start with. There is nothing I hate more than presentations that talk about all millennials are like this, all baby boomers are like this, all women are like this. It drives me crazy. And I will correct myself a couple times during this presentation when I talk about big generalizations about entire groups of people that cover 15 years of a generation. Not everyone in any of these generations is the same. I think what's valuable about this study and insight is to really think about how can we relate to one another? What is the perspective that people are bringing into into conversations, into the workforce, into our families. Most of us are seeing multiple generations, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 generations in the workforce right now. Many of us are also experiencing 3, 4, 5 generations in our families. So being able to recognize what shaped those generations' experiences, what might shape their perspectives, I think that's the valuable part of looking at multi-generations, as opposed to defining people by their stereotypes. So the goal isn't to leave here with a pack of stickers that you can place on people and decide what you think about them from first glance or by checking their age on their driver's license. The point is more about how can we think about what is the perspective I might be bringing? What are the factors that have shaped what I might be bringing to this conversation, and what are the factors that might have shaped what someone else is bringing? That's what I think is so interesting about these generational conversations. So the definition of a generation is comprised of people who share a similar age and life stage. So they've been shaped during their formative years by similar conditions and technologies. Now we're looking at these generations broadly across the U.S. So of course, where you grew up, the socioeconomic background of where you grew up, the education of yourself, your parents, where you lived, those all have big impacts. So we're looking really broadly at these generations across the country, recognizing those micro factors will also have a big impact on the perspectives people are bringing. But in general, when we look at these generations, they've lived through the same global and macro events and experiences that have impacted them and formed some of their perspectives. Therefore, they have some common experiences and some shared values that they bring to the workforce and to life in general. So what we want to look at in thinking about what influenced their perspective, what was happening in politics, in world affairs, in the economy? What were their relationships with adults and parents? What was happening with technology? What was newly invented when they were growing up? What are these common experiences that they've gone through together as a group that might be different from people a generation ahead of them or a generation behind them? And most importantly, how does that influence their perspective? And most importantly, how does that influence how you work or interact with them? What is the baggage, and baggage in a good way sometimes baggage in a bad way, what are we all bringing to the workforce that's impacting how we work with one another? So what's ahead, or in some organizations happening now, is 5 generations working side by side by 2020. We expect to have a workforce with 5 generations working side by side. That will be the first time we've had this great of breadth. Now, some organizations won't have traditionalists in the workforce at the same time that they have Gen Zers. I'm going to call this Gen 2020. But many organizations will experience that. And like I said, if you're not experiencing it in the workforce, you are probably experiencing that in other places in your lives. So as we go through this conversation, I find it really helpful to pinpoint in my mind who's a traditionalist I work with and who's one in my family. I try to put specific people in my mind as I go through this, because then it helps me understand, yeah, though that does apply to this person, or no, that really doesn't, but these pieces do. So I think to bring it down from the purely theoretical and think about who do I work with or who do I live with that falls in one of these groups, I think helps us make this application a little bit more practical than purely theoretical. So the traditionalists were born between 1900 and 1945. So this year they're turning 72 or older. So what were the things that shaped their perspective? What were the experiences that they went through as they grew up that might have formed how they see the world? Well, they lived through the Great Depression in many cases. They experienced World War II from one perspective or another. So a lot of the result of that is this sense of duty and honor, a real pride in country, real national pride, a real sense of dedication and sacrifice, discipline and patience, the thought of you pay your dues, you're loyal, you stand by your country, you stand by your firm, you stand by your family, this real sense of loyalty, a real we first mentality. So you can see how that might apply in the workplace. You can see how that might apply in the family. You can imagine when we get to some of the later generations how that might create some conflict with people that grew up with different experience and different loyalties, and we first might not be their primary thought process. So we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But they also saw hard times and then prosperity as a result of their hard work in those hard times. Well, that translates into what they believe works in the workplace. Hard work, deep, deep loyalty, and then prosperity, and that it's supposed to go in that order. You're supposed to have hard times, hard work, and then prosperity, not in some other order. We'll see how that translates to other generations in a couple of minutes. Doing a good job was most important. Loyalty was very important. Age translated to seniority very often. I see smiles and nodding heads. I think some of you can relate to these people someplace in your life, perhaps. Then we had the baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964, so currently between 53 and 71 years old. Oh, I should also say, if you have also studied this topic over the years, you've probably seen a year or two movement on either end of this range. So don't freak out about the exact definitions of the generations. These are the most common I have seen in the parameters, the years around these generations. But you'll find that there are people who might find out today that they were in one generation, not the other. Don't worry about that. Especially if you're right on the border, you're probably experiencing the factors that come from both of these. So we don't all have to put ourselves squarely in a bucket and recognize, depending on what you read, those are going to shift around a little bit. So the baby boomers, some of the experiences, the global experiences, the country experiences that formed their makeup of what they bring to the workplace. Vietnam, the moon landing, civil and women's rights, kind of uprising within our communities, uprising and innovation within our country. The baby boomers developed a very highly competitive spirit in the workforce and a reputation as workaholics, really, really putting in the hours. This is what counts. I'm watching when you come in the door. I'm watching when you leave. Success for boomers, again, and here's why I will disclaim, I know this isn't all boomers, but the generalization about baby boomers is that success is largely visible. So when we do something well, we give a trophy. We hang our plaques on our wall. I can frequently tell when I used to walk into clients' offices and walk down the hall, I could tell which offices were owned by baby boomers and which ones were not, because the baby boomers had their diplomas and every certificate back to, their reading certificate from second grade is laminated on the wall. I can tell a boomer from what they have on their walls. And those visible representations of success, really important to boomers. Well, that's important. Let's say you're a Gen Xer and you're saying, why does this idiot have all that stuff hanging on his wall? Well, that's how they visualize success. And if you're an Xer and a boomer gives you a trophy, they mean that as a nice thing. They're saying, I see you as being successful. Here's a trophy. And the Xers are like, why are you in my office? Take your trinket and go away. So this is about understanding where are people coming from. How do we communicate to boomers that we value them? And how do we hear value from boomers? So it's a two-way street to understand this perspective. Also, as I mentioned on here, lifestyle elements, that visible success of I've worked hard, I've competed, and now I have the nicest car. Now I have the nicest boat. So these real visual representations, which in some future generations actually started to flip-flop. The people that were making the most money didn't want the nicest car. They kind of rebelled against that boomer lifestyle elements as a visual piece of success. Boomers tend to be optimistic, especially compared to the generation before them and the generation after them. Big consumers, big spenders, which we're seeing a lot now as they're approaching retirement, and many aren't prepared. They were consumers because they spent money on that BMW to demonstrate that they had done it, that they'd achieved. And in many cases defined by their jobs, which is also so important for those of us that work in the business community and see businesses going through transition, that question of who am I when I'm not this person anymore, if I don't own this business anymore, if I'm not in this position anymore, if I can't walk into a room like this and be known for my career, my contributions, because that's what I focused on. That's where I was competitive. That's where I was a workaholic. What happens when I transition out of that? Who am I going to be? I think huge business opportunity counseling for boomers who are retiring about who they're going to be and what they're going to do next and where they're going to translate value for the next cycle of their life, because it's going to be long. We're going to have a lot of boomers that are out of the workforce and looking for meaning in their life. I think it's a huge opportunity. Okay, the next generation, Gen X, 1965 to 1976, frequently now referred to as the forgotten generation because no one cares about us. 41 to 52 years old. It's actually interesting because I think it was Gen X entering the workforce that really started a lot of this research about generations in the workforce. This was there wasn't a huge divide between traditionalists and boomers and how they came to work, how they thought you were supposed to work your way up and pull up your bootstraps. Then Gen Xers came, and all of those people were like, oh my gosh, what do we do with these people? And that's when all this research started about what do we do with these Gen Xers? They have no work ethic. They don't want to talk to anybody. They're antisocial. I'm one of these people, so I'm not insulting anyone in the room any more than I'm insulting myself. But we really focused on Gen X for a short amount of time, and then we saw the millennials over the hill, and we're like, okay, forget Gen X altogether. We're going to find something more interesting to talk about. But there was a lot of drama around Gen X when we first started doing this research. So Gen X really came of age when our national institutions were under fire. The first presidential election that I voted in, I turned 18 the year that Clinton was up for election the first time. So this idea of do we trust the government? What are these people doing? And so much more access to information about what public figures were doing, and really a lot of pressure around our financial institutions, our political institutions, really created this generation of cynics and pessimists who said, gosh, is this really what you guys have created for us? Is this really what's ahead? They also saw a lot of layoffs, so an end of that concept of lifelong employment. So the generations before them believed that a pension was a thing. They believed that that Social Security was actually going to be available when they retired. Gen X, super skeptical about that. They've said, I've seen my parents get laid off. I've seen my neighbors and uncles. I don't believe in this. I've seen pension plans disappear because of these corrupt organizations. They don't have that trust or that belief in lifelong employment. They have this core, again, generalization, but this core belief that this company never promised me anything, and that translates to what they're willing to promise and what they're willing to commit. They're suspicious of boomers' values. They're suspicious, actually, of kind of that generation ahead of them in total, and certainly that idea of competition, committing 100% to your work, not having a life aside from that. They also were raised as their parents' friends, and I always highlight this as what I really see as a key. You know how I said the traditionalists and the boomers got along okay in the workplace, and then the Xers came in and everything hit the fan? This was one of the big reasons why. Boomers knew not to speak unless they were spoken to. If their parents had a dinner party, they were not invited to the dinner party. It would have been ridiculous to think that you would hang out with the adults. Gen Xers were the first generation. All the others that followed have had this same experience, but Gen Xers were the first ones that were at the dinner party, at the table with the adults, chit-chatting about life events, even if they didn't know anything about it, and their parents said, you're so smart, you're doing such a great job. And they're the ones that played sports at school. You've heard the example about everybody gets a trophy, but they got a ribbon for participating. And the boomers, they're saying, I worked my tail off for that blue ribbon, and here you are with your participation ribbon, and the Xers are saying, where's my participation ribbon? So these two forces come together in the workplace, and they just have really different expectations about what you have to do to be seen as successful and what you have to do to earn the right to participate or earn the right to speak. So that, I think, is where the first big conflict came in the workplace. They're also much more self-reliant, had to learn to fend for themselves. This was the first generation that had a lot more families with two working parents, a lot more latchkey kids in Gen X. So they kind of grew up with that independent, yes, I might be getting some instruction, but I know I'm going to be, preparing my own snack. That translates to the workplace. We'll talk in a few minutes about how, but that self-reliance, it translates into how they show up. It translates into how they work with teams. So then you picture them working with a generation that had been that had not been very self-reliant. They had been very closely parented, and then they're working with the generation after them that was very closely parented, and they're in the middle saying, we don't all need to talk about this. I've given you your instructions. Go do your work. Come back to me when you're done. That's how all this translates into the workplace. That's so interesting. They also see themselves as free agents. I'm happy here until the next best deal comes along. They have seen that in the workplace. They've seen that in the sports world. They consider themselves free agents. They certainly don't have that loyalty that the traditionalists had and that even translated into the baby boomers. We all have to recognize how that translates into the workforce when we're working with Gen X and the generations that follow. Okay, so then the next generation, millennials, born between 1977 and 1997. The oldest millennials are turning 40 this year. Isn't that interesting? I still think of millennials being like snot-nosed 22-year-olds. They're not. The 22-year-olds are a whole different group now. So the millennials are turning 40. They're also turning 20, so it's a wide generation. But the millennials, one of the things that really kind of spurred the flip from Gen X to millennials was 9/11. That's one of the kind of defining factors of this generation was the age that they were, the formative age that they were at the time of 9/11. Yet they tend to be a more optimistic and self-confident group than the Xers were before them because they came after some of the they obviously had their own economic ups and downs during their upbringing, but they missed some of the things that the Xers participated in. So the millennials are also individualistic, like the Xers were, but much more group-oriented. So their individualism shows up more in, I want a highly customized experience, and I want to hang out with you while I'm having it. I want my iPhone highly customized, but could we all sit together on our iPhones? The Gen Xers take their iPhone back to their own office because why do we need to be together while we're all on our iPhones? The millennials want to be together even if they're on their own, having their own customized, personalized experience. They want to do that together. They also have, as I'm sure you've heard before, difficulty focusing on non-stimulating stuff. When you actually look at the brain development of millennials and the generations that follow and the constant barrage of information and technology, it's so different than the brain development of the generations that came before. So I don't see this just as a lack of focus. It really is a different brain development and a different ability to focus on stuff that isn't stimulating and a different level of patience and tolerance for stuff that doesn't feel relevant in the moment. What that means to those of us that work with millennials is we have to make stuff relevant within the moment. I'm not sure that's entirely bad. It's just a different way. We can't expect someone to do something boring for 3 years and say, this is the most satisfying career I've ever had. We have to make it relevant for them in the moment. They're also busy. Busy. This is the most scheduled generation ever to happen. They had activities after school every day. They went from piano to ballet to karate 5 nights a week. And then the weekends were filled with activities, very different than the generations before them. Helicopter parented. So parents hovering wanted to make sure everything was taken care of, that they're not only were they having piano and ballet, but they were having culture enrichment classes after school as well. Very helicopter parented. Wanted to make sure our kids are super competitive, that they're super emotionally healthy. Very, very parented group of kids. Very interesting also that this is a generation that's very race and gender neutral and also geography neutral. Very confused. I was sharing a story over lunch that my 10-year-old son, I was going to New York to speak on a panel of women executives about women's leadership development. And my 10-year-old was like, why is that a thing? Like, why is there a thing about women's leadership development? And so I'm explaining it to him and he's like, I don't get that. And he thinks I'm just going because I love New York. And I do, but he doesn't even get that that's a thing. The race and gender issue that so many of us have studied and worked at and grown up in, this generation and the one that follows really sees that as a strange thing that we're even talking about, which I think is a hopeful projection as well. Also geography neutral. They don't understand why job postings have locations. That seems very irrelevant to them. They expect us to be able to accommodate where they want to be. And more, we do have to be able to accommodate where they want to be. Geography neutral, they can move wherever they want. Remember how hard it was for traditionalists to relocate. It was almost unheard of. Millennials, their friends have relocated, their families have relocated. They expect to be wherever they want, and they don't expect that to impact their employability or your desire to employ them wherever you might be located. Very community and service oriented. So very high interest in doing community focused work and having their altruistic desires hit with their day-to-day work as well. So they want their day-to-day work to be meaningful, and if it's not, they're going to go out and find something else to do where they can find meaning. So for many of us in traditional industries, we have to really connect our people to the purpose of what we're doing, because for many of us, our work does connect with great meaning and purpose, but we haven't always taken the time to message that to people. What is it that our work is really accomplishing? So I think that community and service orientation and engaging, they don't all have to work for nonprofits to have an impact. There are a lot of jobs where they can have an impact, but we have to help them with that translation. Millennials are also super ambitious, but they appear aimless sometimes. I think this is one of the biggest misperceptions is I hear millennials, you know, they're slackers, they don't get anything done, they're aimless. You'll hear a millennial on the panel after the break, and I challenge you to say that she's aimless and unambitious. I do think that that ambitious might show up differently than it did for boomers and than it did for Gen Xers. Their ambition might not show up in, yes, I'm willing to stay here and do exactly what you tell me to do for 20 years, and then I'll hang a plaque on my wall. Their ambition is going to show up differently, and that makes it hard for people to relate to. Wait a minute, you don't want to grow up and achieve success the same way I did? So we have to recognize it might be different, but don't misinterpret it as lack of ambition. Okay, Gen Z. How am I doing on time? Okay. Gen Z, I'm talking as fast as I can. Gen Z, born after 1995, under 22 years old, so in many cases just now entering the workforce. Gen Z also shaped by a decade of war and economic uncertainty. This is going to be a very different generation, though. We haven't experienced them in great depth at Moss Adams because we are just hiring our very first Gen Zs, but I've been doing a lot of research around this particular generation. And what people are saying is that the Gen Zers are thinking of their future more like children that were raised in the 30s. So not only are they skipping back a couple of generations, they're actually skipping back several generations. Well, think about what has formed their perspective on security. Safety, personal safety and security, internet of having your data out in the web, security of being able to get and hold a job. So they haven't even heard the word pension before. Like that is not even, if we even told them what Social Security was, they'd be like, yeah, that's not happening. You are all crazy. So they're very dubious and fearful of their short-term safety and their long-term prospects. A much, much more conservative, planning-oriented, worried, anxious group of young people. Which might make them super easy to manipulate. No, I'm kidding. But we do expect them to be more pragmatic. They have lower expectations, which I don't want us to take advantage of. But it is really interesting to see this isn't just an evolution of the same traits. We are actually seeing some traits of prior generations come back into the workforce with this new generation, which I think is fascinating. The technology revolution, obviously complete. They're completely connected. Most access 5 or more screens a day. 41% of their time is spent with computers. 40% say working Wi-Fi is more important than working bathrooms. 80% say they would rather share socks than share workspace. So very interesting about how they want to work and what's more important to them. Yet, what I think is very interesting, like the millennials, they really want that human connection. They really want to work together. So they want really strong technology, but not so they can be off by themselves. They want really strong technology to make us all more productive when we're working together. Their social media use is also more anonymous than millennials. They have many more privacy concerns. That goes back to that early bullet point on safety, really being concerned about safety. They actually believe that your internet use as a kid can impact your ability to get a job. I was sharing this morning, my daughter, who's in first grade now, started in kindergarten with her unit every semester about internet safety in her technology class. So she nags me about my passwords. Mom, your last name can't be your passwords. I've changed all my passwords to Quinn's instructions. When she was in kindergarten, she came home and made me fix all my passwords. So they're much more protective and thoughtful about what they're putting out there in the world. A little bit more data on Gen Z. There's 60 million Gen Zers, even more than millennials. 75% believe there are good ways to get an education other than going to college. How does that impact us? How does it impact where we recruit and hire from? 76% are willing to start at the bottom of the ladder and work their way up, a much higher number than the 2 generations before them. 91% say technological sophistication impacts where they want to work. They don't all want to work in the tech sector, but they want to work for a company that is technologically sophisticated and can support their best work. 82% prefer face-to-face communication. 56% want to write their own job descriptions. Average attention span. So a goldfish. If you have a goldfish bowl and you put your finger on the goldfish bowl and the goldfish swims over and looks at your finger and you're talking to the goldfish, they will stay there and pay attention to this is research. Research actually shows this. They will pay attention to your finger for 9 seconds. A Gen Zer will pay attention to you for 8 seconds, and that's engaged in one-on-one conversation. So again, going back to that concept of it's got to be relevant because we have increasingly short attention spans. And again, that goes back to the way our synapses in our brain are being developed. This is getting hardwired into our attention span. 32% have a parent that started their own business. Entrepreneurship is in their DNA. They will approach work and the workforce very differently. 75% wish their current hobby could become their full-time job, and they'll be looking to us to help them create that experience. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple of these because I think we're out of time. I have 2 minutes. 2020 projections. So by 2020, we expect Gen Y, the millennials, to be 50% or more of the population. In some of our organizations, they're already there. This is a real key. Generational repetition is a concept that says each generation assumes the following generations will want what they have and will share their same definition of success. This is a key concept that we have to blow up in the workplace. I was sharing this morning, the first time I said to someone, okay, I'm going to coach you on how to make it to partner at Moss Adams. She's like, oh God, I don't want to be a partner. And I was like, okay, I don't know what to do with you. All I know what to do is tell you what my path is and what I did because I assume you want to be me. And she's like, I don't want to be you. Okay, I'm lost. So that concept of working with someone to define their definition of success and their path instead of assuming they want what we want or we want it at their age, and that they're going to do the same things to get there. That destination, that path are going to be very, very different for the generations coming up. With few exceptions also, each generation thinks the next generation had it much easier. I know Gen Xers had it the hardest. All of you think you had it the hardest. But this concept of really thinking about where are people trying to go and what insights and experiences are they bringing from their background that's influencing what they're bringing to the workplace, or like I said, to your lives, to your families. I think it's such a fascinating conversation. I think I'm supposed to wrap up. I have like 40 more slides, but should we go to Q&A instead? Would that be helpful? How much more time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay. Sure. Yeah, are there questions? Do you want to see what my next slides were? And I am actually happy to distribute the slides. I in fact included some here that I knew that we wouldn't have time to get to, but some ideas about how different generations in the workforce like communication, how they see work ethic. So some kind of practical ways to translate this into the workforce. More than happy to translate the slides. Again, it's lots of content. Okay, I have 1 minute, it says. Do you think social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, etc., are positive or negative for the economy? I think they are positive for the economy. I think they are creating incredible new flows of financing and cash that I had never anticipated. I think they're good for the economy. I'm not sure how they are for human relations. I think they create more distance between people's, not just their eyeballs, but more distance between people's personal connections. And that's my biggest fear about social media, isn't how it's going to impact the economy, but how it's going to impact people's care for one another, and the ability to have a screen, literally a screen between you and the next person, I think changes how we connect with one another. Now, could that ultimately have an impact on our politics and an impact on our economy? Absolutely. I absolutely think it will. Direct impact, I'm not concerned about. Indirect impact, I'm certainly concerned about. Thoughts on the earning powers of millennials and Generation Z to support the large number of boomers retiring. We're going to get super creative around this issue. As mentioned in the introduction, I ran our wealth management group for 8 years, and it's not only that. I think there's also the millennials and Gen Z. Luckily, there are a lot of them, so we have a lot of them. They need to earn a lot because the boomers didn't save very much because they were buying BMWs and boats. So we actually need high earning power, and I'm actually not concerned about that. I do think the ways that millennials and Gen Zs are going to create wealth and support, whether Social Security makes it or not, the way they're going to support the generations above them, whether that's retirement payments in their organizations or being able to buy their businesses or being able to move their parents into their homes, however it is they need to economically support those prior generations. I think the economic model of the millennials and Gen Zs, many of us haven't even envisioned yet. How they're going to make money from their businesses. We were talking earlier about a golf course, and how are the Gen Zers going to connect to that concept of joining amazing business opportunity. It's going to look very different than how the boomers wanted to connect. So those business models of how they're going to create wealth, I think are going to look very different. But are they going to create wealth? Absolutely. They're very hard workers, incredibly intelligent, very innovative, very entrepreneurial, as we saw in the statistics. I think that creates huge opportunity. But I think that the way they're going to do that is going to be very different than the examples that have been set for them by the generations ahead of them. Oh, there's another question. Okay, as Gen Y and Z become a larger share of the workforce, how do you see the business community balancing wage demands and entrepreneurial competition from these generations? I think the wage demand and competition for talent, we talked about this a little bit earlier, I think is going to be huge. You made the comment about it's not just going to be public and private, it's going to be private competing with private. And wages are going to play a huge factor in how we're all competing for this talent. I also think we need to recognize the value that these generations place on things other than money, the value they place on experiences and how those experiences help them live their life and raise their family and have balance. I do think that in many cases we have boomers creating compensation systems and incentive systems. They still have the biggest impact on designing those systems, and that will, by default, create a wage variable that looks like what we've had in the past, but just increased by 7% a year. I think we need to involve our millennials and our Gen Zers in the design of our compensation plans and the design of our total rewards, because I think that'll help us innovate around how we value people's time, how we build their career path. I know a lot of people that would give a lot for more flexibility. And that's true across many generations, but it's particularly true across those. So it's another area where I think if we just look at the old dynamic of competition for talent and wages growing at the percentage that they have been, which we are predicting this year at Moss Adams, wages are going to increase like they did last year, which was twice as much as our ability to translate that to the market in what we charge our clients. So that's not sustainable. We have to come up with a different way to value what people are bringing to the workforce and help them create that wealth, to tie back to that prior card, that's going to help retire the people ahead of them. But we have to recognize a new equation there, and I think we have to involve the millennials and the Zers in that conversation. There's a couple more questions coming. Are we okay on time? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Does Moss Adams accommodate hoteling? I was wondering where this was going. Does Moss Adams accommodate hoteling, for instance, a Medford accountant working from Portland or from home? Yes, and increasingly. So we really recognize the need for options in our workplace. So yes, we have a lot of millennials. We also have a lot of boomers. So we have a lot of options in how we communicate and in how we create workplace environments. So we actually just went through a remodel in Seattle, which is where I'm based. We moved into our new space in August. We were remodeling from January through August. That framework that we created in that office move is going to translate into all of our other markets over time. So as our leases come up in other markets, we'll be replicating this same philosophy around space, which is we went from 4 floors in our building in Seattle to 3 floors in our building in Seattle. This is a 10-year lease. So we're not just looking at the space we need now, we're looking at 10 years, projecting our growth. We've been growing at double digits every year, and we expect to, but we're shrinking our space. We used to have, if you've ever been in a public accounting firm, we had beautiful offices around the outside and big seas of cubicles on the insides. All the offices are gone. All the cubes are along the windows, because it turns out our millennials don't want to sit in the crappy space in the middle of the building. So we have a lot more light and sun exposure, and people have complete flexibility on where they sit. So I don't have an assigned seat. I sign up for where I'm going to sit, and I can sit anywhere in the building, as can anyone on the team. So you congregate around the team that you need to be with, the days that you need to be with them, and then you move to another space. It did a lot of things. First of all, it creates that options idea. If you need a room with a door for the day, you book a room with a door, no matter who you are. If you want to drop in between meetings and sit at a high counter along the window with a great view, you can do that. There's great technology so you can plug in. So really moving to more options and less hierarchy. Our space, especially in public accounting, for a long time, your space has been dictated by your hierarchy. I remember sitting next to an empty corner office for a year waiting for my next promotion so I could move into that space. And it was vacant. I mean, we're crazy people. But I think that removing the connection between hierarchy and instead connecting with, well, what are your needs for the day? And that's the kind of space that you'll be in. It's also allowing us to control our real estate costs. We're in a lot of very expensive markets, and we need to be able to control that cost. So being able to carve out, not only do we go from 4 floors to 3, what we had looked at in our 10-year staffing projections, we were going to have to go from 4 to 5.5 over that time. So we carved back not only from where we were, but from where we were going to have to be if we had continued with that same windows along the wall, you have a space whether you're in the office or not sort of mentality. So along with that, to get to the question on the card, has created a lot more need for flexibility. So in some of our groups in the Seattle office, which again, this is coming to all of our other markets, but in Seattle, we don't have a seat for every person in the audit practice. So they're either in the field with a client, or they're working in one of those flexible spaces, or they're working at Starbucks, or they're working from home. And we have built our technology platform to really allow them to be effective in doing that. In some of our groups, we've instituted no faceless meetings. So if you're out of the office, no problem. But if we have a meeting, you have to connect by video. We don't find phone calls to be super effective, especially with a group. So yes, you can be remote, but I have to be able to see your face. So some groups have put those policies in place. So yes, I think we do have really good flexibility that's growing in some markets. So the question was about Medford in particular. That hasn't all come to Medford yet, but it will as our leases are up for renewal. It's going to hit our whole footprint. I was so skeptical about it. By the way, I was like, oh my gosh, all this stuff we're doing to accommodate millennials. It's actually been incredibly cool, and I found my ability to connect with other people in the office has been so much greater, and especially for the generations, but even the Xers that like to be alone, this ability to feel connected to the people at work as we're all over the place all the time. When we are in the office, this environment makes it much more open to creating relationships. I'm going to hit one more quick point because it's really relevant to that. It's on one of my very last slides here. And you can have all these slides because now you're seeing how cool they are and you're feeling sad that you missed them. But on this very last slide, this is a very important point, this first one. I think it's very important to value the generations. So don't look at this as an equation of how do we accommodate these generations? How do we wait for them to grow up and be who we want them to be? I think it's really important that we look at this instead in recognizing if we can incorporate diversity in generations or in any other form, it actually helps us make better decisions. We will build better businesses and get better results if we incorporate open arm multiple generations in our workforce. It could be one of the most powerful workforces if we are doing that instead of saying, when is he going to retire? How much longer do we have to have all these generations here, and when are they going to grow up? If instead we look at it from a place of appreciation and value and recognizing that that's going to make us stronger businesses, I think that's the exciting part about these insights around the generations. It's not so much about how can we understand and excuse what people are doing? Instead, it's how can we really understand where they're coming from so we can take advantage of all these perspectives that are coming to the workforce. So if you'd like the rest of these slides, we're happy to share them. I'll make sure SOREDI has them, and you're welcome to have them. But I appreciate your time. Thank you, guys.